because it's different than what I do during the week. So coming here and actually meeting people in a different medium is really nice. One of the unique things about this site is that it encompasses the entire history of California. There was an Ohlone Indian village here when the Spanish exploring party came up, the Portola party who sighted San Francisco Bay. They camped not too far from here, and the Indians from this village were actually with them on a hunting expedition when they founded the bay. The Indians from this village were taken into the Mission Dolores when it was established, and then this site became the support farm for the Mission Dolores about 10 years after the mission was working, because they couldn't grow the food there to sustain the population. And so they came down here, and this valley became the support farm for the Mission Dolores. And then when the missions were desecularized, this site became a cattle ranch for Don Francisco Sanchez, who was a first-generation Californian. And his family was here throughout when the Americans then came, and California then became part of the United States. When Don Francisco Sanchez died, his wife had a lot of minor children left at home. And so what she did was she took the 9,000 acres, that was roughly what the rancho was, and she broke it up into parcels, and she sold some, and she held some as other inheritance for her sons. The house was eventually bought by a couple by the name of General Edward Kirkpatrick and his wife, the Baroness Marguerite. He was a lawyer in San Francisco, and this was like his country house, and they put in formal gardens. And over the years, it was a speakeasy during Prohibition. It was a hotel for people coming down on the Ocean Shore Railroad. It was a restaurant. Went through a lot of different uses. It was always actively used, and one of the really fortunate things is that it always had a roof on it, no matter what happened to it. Just prior to being sold to the county, it was just used as an artichoke shed, but it always had a roof on it, and if it didn't have that, we probably would have lost it, because adobe will melt if it's exposed to the elements. One of the really unique things about the adobe is the structure of the house itself. It's very reminiscent of how the Spanish colonized a large part of the United States. In California, this was sort of a standard house for the Spanish families that lived here. It's a 6-room adobe, 3 rooms downstairs, 3 rooms upstairs. The family was large. The family that lived in this house was Don Francisco Sanchez and his wife Teodora. By the time their youngest was born, their oldest was married. And in this house, when you're working in it every day, you can hear everything. So you can imagine what Mrs. Sanchez must have, the noise level of having 10 kids in this house, and probably cousins who stayed here too. Because when families visited, they usually visited for long periods of time because traveling was so hard. The Sanchez's lived here, and from what we can tell from the censuses, this was their full-time residence after California joined the United States. And both Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez were educated. They had 2 Indian servants who lived with the family. They also had an American man who was living here. He was noted in the census as being 25 years old, and his personal property was $10 in gold. Life here was very busy. It was a working cattle ranch. That was their livelihood. When you look at the structure of the house, you'll notice that there's 2 very large porches on the upper portion of the house. Now, when the restoration was done in 1953, they put the porch all the way around the house. Back then, the porches were only on the long sides of the houses, and there were windbreaks on the ends. The kitchen was off the long end of one side of the house. It wasn't attached to the house. And so there were constantly people working down there. There were animals. They were raising their own food here. Mrs. Sanchez and the servants that lived with her, they worked very hard in order to feed all those people. It was constantly, you had jobs to do all day long. I don't think it was an easy life. Time was different then. You weren't trying to squeeze everything into such, our days are so packed now. with the, going into the city to work or whatever it is that, we're doing, then where they lived and where they worked was the same place. And your community was the people you spent all day with. It was your family. I think it was a more gracious lifestyle. The time they spent on everything was really different. Like if you had a party, well, the party here back then would last like 3 days. It didn't just last one evening, because you worked so hard, and people would have to come in from so far away, and they would just stay, and so it would last for 3 days or 4 days. The way you entertained yourself was really different. The vaqueros who worked on the ranch worked really hard all day long, but the skills that they learned and what they did were also part of their entertainment. The vaqueros in California were supposed to be some of the best horsemen ever. They spent all day in the saddle. They worked really hard. The cattle were spread out. Well, this ranch was roughly 9,000 acres. Your value of what you had was in barter. You didn't have cash or currency. They would slaughter the cattle. They would take the tallow out. They would stake out the hides, dry the hides, and they would trade with the ships coming into the Embarcadero. Don Francisco's father owned Rancho Buri Buri, which was on the other side of the hills here, and went roughly from probably about, I think like Daly City down to almost Redwood City. It was pretty large. And he had an Embarcadero over there. And so the ships would come in and they'd take all the hides and tallow over to the ship, and then they'd trade with whatever the captain, whatever goods he had. What we consider today to be the cattle industry is beef. Back then, that isn't what it was. It was the hides and tallow, because there was no refrigeration. The beef was left wherever you slaughtered the cattle. And because of that, the population of grizzly bear in California really rose. One of the big entertainments that they had in San Francisco back then, during the gold rush for the gold miners, when they used to come down from the hills, was the bear and bullfights. They would bring the grizzly bears in and a bull, and they would put a grizzly bear against a bull, and they would fight it out. Sort of like the Christians and the lions back in the Roman times. It isn't what we would consider entertainment today, but they really enjoyed it back then. It was big entertainment. And that's where some of the terms from our stock market comes today, is from the bear and the bullfights. Every time you're with a group, you're taking people around, it's never the same. It's always different, depending on the people that you're talking with. So that's one of the interesting things about it, is that nothing's ever the same twice.